The desert wind carried a lonely whistle across the auction yard, rattling the brittle wood of the stage where the slaves were displayed like worn-out tools. It was late afternoon in Dry Creek, a frontier town known for its saloons, dust storms, and the lingering smell of gunpowder. The sun dipped low, casting amber light over the gathering crowd. Men in rough coats and wide-brimmed hats gathered around, their eyes hungry for bargains and amusement. That day, a special auction had drawn the town's attention, an Apache lot, as the auctioneer called it. Native captives were rare now, and the traders wanted to rid themselves of what they couldn't keep. But among the men, laughter died as soon as the next figure stepped onto the stage. She was small, barely more than a girl, wrapped in torn deerskin and rope. Her wrists were bound, her feet dusty and cracked. Her long black hair hung over her face, but her eyes, those dark, motionless eyes, met no one's. She didn't struggle, didn't cry, didn't even look afraid. She just stood there, silent as stone. The auctioneer cleared his throat and shouted her details. An Apache slave, captured from a raided camp near the northern ridge, strong enough to work, silent as a church mouse, he said. Good for labor or company. 50% off since she's been difficult. Laughter rippled weakly through the crowd, but no one moved. The silence deepened, even the wind seemed to still. Men looked at each other, unsure. Buying an Apache girl meant trouble, vengeance from her kin, whispers from neighbors, maybe even guilt that no whiskey could drown. The auctioneer grew impatient. He dropped the price lower. Still, no takers. He tried again, his voice cracking with desperation. "Come on, boys, half price. She won't bite." But it wasn't her silence that kept them away. It was her eyes. They were too calm, too alive, like she was watching every man there and finding them all the same. Something about that quiet defiance unsettled them. At the back of the crowd, leaning against a hitching post, stood a man named Luke Callahan, a drifter, a cowboy without a brand, known for his steady hands and quieter temper. He'd come to Dry Creek for work, not for slaves. His horse was tied beside him, dust-caked and weary. He had no interest in the spectacle before him, until he looked up and met those dark eyes. For a long moment something unspoken passed between them. The girl didn't flinch, she didn't plead. She just stared at him, like she already knew something. He didn't. Luke pushed off the post and walked closer. The crowd parted, murmuring as he moved through. His boots scuffed the dust, his hat shadowing his expression. "Any takers going once, going twice?" The auctioneer began, his voice rising. Luke raised his hand. The crowd gasped. The auctioneer blinked in disbelief, then slammed his hammer down. "Sold! To the cowboy in the hat!" Murmurs broke out like wildfire. "Crazy fool," someone whispered. "That Apache'll slit his throat in his sleep." Another laughed, shaking his head. "Some men can't tell trouble when it's staring 'em in the face." Luke ignored them. He stepped up, handed over his last few coins, everything he had left from his last cattle drive, and took the rope from the auctioneer's hand. The girl didn't move, didn't resist. Her gaze stayed fixed on him, cool and unreadable. When he led her away from the stage, the crowd's voices faded into the wind. Behind them, the auctioneer called out the next lot, his words blending into the hum of the dying day. But the weight of what Luke had just done hung heavy in the air. He didn't know her name, didn't know why she'd been captured, or what had been done to her. All he knew was that she was alone, and so was he. They reached his horse, and Luke hesitated. The girl stood beside him, motionless, her eyes scanning the horizon like she expected to see ghosts. He cut her ropes loose, one by one. The crowd might have thought he was mad, but he wasn't about to drag another human being behind him like an animal. She didn't run. That surprised him more than anything. Instead, she rubbed her wrists, then glanced at the setting sun. For a heartbeat, he thought she might speak, but she didn't. She simply walked to the other side of the horse and waited, quiet as before. Luke mounted up, still watching her. Finally, he nodded toward the trail out of town. She followed on foot, her shadow long against the dust. As they left Dry Creek behind, the whispers of the town faded with the light. The desert swallowed them both, one man and one silent girl, walking into the unknown. Luke didn't yet understand why he'd raised his hand. Maybe it was pity, maybe guilt, or maybe, though he couldn't yet admit it, it was because something in her silence felt like his own. Behind them, the last rays of sun fell across the empty auction block. The wind picked up again, swirling dust where the girl had stood moments before, and in the quiet of the coming night, the prairie seemed to breathe, as if the land itself knew their story was only beginning. The trail out of Dry Creek stretched endlessly ahead, an ocean of sand and sagebrush shimmering under the sinking sun. The land was silent except for the crunch of boots and hooves against dry earth. Luke Callahan rode slow, his worn hat pulled low to shade his eyes. Beside him walked the Apache girl, barefoot, steady, her gaze locked forward like the horizon itself was calling her name. Luke hadn't planned for this, hadn't planned for her. The girl hadn't spoken a single word since the auction. She didn't ask where they were going, didn't plead, didn't even glance at him unless he stopped too long. Every step she took seemed measured, careful, as though she feared nothing yet trusted no one. They traveled for hours without a sound, only the groan of saddle leather and the soft hiss of desert wind between the rocks. Occasionally Luke glanced down at her from his horse, wondering what she was thinking, if she was thinking at all, but her face, calm and expressionless, revealed nothing. When the sky turned purple and the first stars blinked awake, Luke finally stopped near a dry creek bed. He dismounted, loosened his horse's reins, and gathered a few scraps of wood for a fire. The girl stood a few yards away, still as a shadow. He built the fire small, just enough to keep the chill off. Its glow flickered across her face, revealing fine features beneath the dust and exhaustion. A face far younger than he'd first thought. She must have been barely 20. But her eyes were ancient, worn by loss and distance. Luke reached into his saddlebag and set a piece of hardtack bread on a flat rock. He placed a canteen beside it and stepped back. The girl hesitated, then approached slowly. She ate without a sound, her movements precise, almost ritualistic. There was grace even in her hunger. Luke watched the flames dance in her eyes. He didn't know what to make of her silence. It was too deep to be fear, too calm to be submission. Maybe it was the only weapon she had left in a world that had taken everything else. As the night deepened, the wind began to whisper through the canyon. Coyotes cried in the distance, their voices thin and lonely. Luke wrapped himself in his coat and leaned back against his saddle. The girl lay on the ground near the fire, facing away from him, her black hair fanning across the dust like spilled ink. Sleep came slow for Luke. He wasn't afraid she'd run. He'd already seen in her eyes that she wouldn't, but something else kept him awake. A weight he couldn't name. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe curiosity. Or maybe it was the strange stillness she carried with her. Something that felt less like silence and more like a secret. By dawn, the fire had burned down to ash. Luke woke to the soft rustle of movement. The girl was already up, kneeling near the creek bed. She was tracing something in the dirt with her finger, symbols, shapes, perhaps words in a language he didn't understand. When she noticed him watching, she erased them quickly and stood. They packed what little they had and continued west. The land grew harsher, rockier, more unforgiving. Days passed like that. The girl remained quiet, walking beside the horse, drinking little, eating even less. Once Luke noticed a scar on her wrist, faint but deep. It wasn't the mark of a rope or chain. It was older, carved with purpose. Some kind of tribal sign, maybe, or a vow. Whatever it was, she kept it hidden beneath her sleeve most of the time. On the third night, a sandstorm rose without warning. The wind screamed through the desert, tearing at their clothes, filling the air with grit. Luke grabbed the reins and pulled the girl close, leading her toward a cluster of rocks. They found shelter beneath an overhang just as the storm swallowed the world outside. The sand roared like thunder. They huddled together in the narrow space, the air thick with dust. The girl's hair whipped across her face, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. She didn't tremble or cry. She just watched the storm, her gaze steady, as though she'd seen worse. Hours passed before the wind died down. When it finally did, the desert lay transformed, a world buried under new dunes and silence. Luke stepped out, coughing, brushing sand from his coat. The girl followed, her expression unreadable. Something shifted between them that night. Not a word was spoken, but the distance seemed to narrow. Maybe it was survival that bound them for now, or maybe something older, unnamed. They reached a valley by the 5th day. A lonely cabin sat near a dried-out riverbed, a place Luke knew from years before when he'd worked cattle in the area. It wasn't much, but it would do for rest. He led the horse into the shade and gestured for the girl to sit near the porch. She obeyed without sound. Inside, dust and memories filled the small wooden space. A table with one chair, a cold hearth, a map nailed crookedly to the wall. Luke began to clear the dust, his mind wandering. He had bought her to save her from whatever fate the auctioneer had planned, but now that he had her, he didn't know what to do next. She wandered through the room, her bare feet soft against the floorboards. Her fingers brushed over the old map, tracing rivers and canyons. Then she stopped before the window and stared out at the horizon. The setting sun poured gold through the glass, wrapping her in light. For the first time Luke noticed something. Her eyes weren't just dark, they were full of sorrow so deep it seemed to echo across the room. He realized then that she wasn't empty. She was enduring, waiting. Night came again, and they slept under the same roof for the first time. The wind whispered outside, carrying the scent of rain. In his half-sleep, Luke thought he heard her move. Not walking, kneeling, whispering something soft and strange in her native tongue, a sound so faint it might have been a dream. When morning came, she was sitting by the window again, watching the sunrise. Her silence was still there, but it had changed, less like a wall, more like a question waiting to be answered. Luke stepped outside, feeling the weight of another day ahead. He didn't know it yet, but their paths were now tied in ways neither could escape. The desert had taken two lost souls and bound them together under its endless sky, and somewhere, beyond those mountains, something, or someone, was coming for her. Days turned into weeks, and the small cabin by the valley became a quiet refuge from the harshness of the desert. Luke Callahan had learned to live with silence, but the girl's silence was different. It wasn't the silence of emptiness, it was the silence of secrets. Every day she moved like part of the wind, tending to small things around the cabin without needing instruction. She fetched water from the creek, mended worn fabric, and built fires with the skill of someone who had survived longer than her years. Luke began to notice her habits, how she would face the sunrise every morning, standing still for long minutes with her eyes closed, or how she would press her hand to her chest whenever thunder rolled across the plains. She never asked for anything, never showed fear, yet something in her movements spoke of waiting, as though she expected the world to change again at any moment. The days passed quietly, until one afternoon, the peace broke. The first sign was the sound of hooves, distant, steady, and deliberate. Luke stepped outside, the sunlight glaring against his hat brim. Down the trail, a lone rider appeared, a figure dressed in dark leather, moving with purpose. The air itself seemed to tighten around his approach. The girl was inside, near the hearth. When she heard the hooves, she froze. Her hands, once steady, began to tremble. She turned toward the window, her eyes narrowing. For the first time since Luke had bought her, a flicker of fear crossed her face. The stranger dismounted before the cabin. He carried no badge, but the weight of violence clung to him like dust. His horse snorted, stamping the earth. The man looked at the cabin, then at the trail behind him, as if expecting to be followed. Luke stood still, hand near his belt, watching. The stranger's gaze met Luke's. Then it shifted, past him, to the shadow inside the cabin. The girl's face appeared in the window, pale against the glass. Her lips parted slightly, and a faint sound escaped her throat, half gasp, half memory. It was then Luke understood. This man wasn't just a traveler, he was looking for her. The moment stretched, silent and sharp. Then, without a word, the stranger turned his horse and rode off, vanishing into the northern hills. But the air he left behind felt heavy, as though a storm was waiting just beyond the horizon. That night the girl didn't sleep. She sat near the dying fire, her eyes fixed on the door. Luke didn't question her, though he wanted to. He could tell that whatever bound her to silence had now cracked open. The following days carried a strange unease. The desert around them seemed quieter, the wind more watchful. Luke began to find traces in the sand, hoof prints near the creek, faint smoke from distant fires. Someone was circling, watching. He tried to busy himself with work, patching fences, tending to his horse, but the feeling of being hunted lingered. The girl's behavior changed too. She spent more time outside, scanning the horizon, sometimes climbing the rocky ridge behind the cabin to stare northward. When she came down, her expression was always the same, calm on the surface but with eyes full of storms. On the seventh night, Luke woke to a faint sound, not the wind, not the coyotes, a whistle, low, rhythmic, coming from the ridge. The girl was gone from her place by the hearth. He stepped outside quietly. The moonlight painted the valley silver. On the ridge he saw her silhouette, standing still facing the north, answering the whistle with a soft hum, almost like a signal. Luke watched, unmoving. When she came back down, she didn't meet his eyes. She simply sat near the fire again and waited for dawn. By morning he knew something was coming. The tracks near the creek were fresh now. More than one rider. Whoever had been scouting before was ready to return. That evening, a storm brewed over the hills. Lightning split the sky, thunder rolling like drums. The girl stood by the door, staring into the storm's heart. When the first drops of rain fell, she stepped outside, lifting her face to the sky, her expression filled with something like sorrow and resolve. Luke followed, keeping a distance. The rain fell harder, washing the dust from the earth, and then, through the curtain of rain, shadows appeared. 3 riders moving in from the north. They came fast, their horses kicking up mud, their forms half hidden by lightning. The girl didn't move. She stood in the open, her hair plastered against her face, her eyes bright in the stormlight. The riders slowed when they saw her. One dismounted, calling something out. A name, perhaps. She didn't answer. Luke's hand tightened on his revolver, but he didn't draw it yet. Something in her stance told him this moment was not his to interrupt. The man who had spoken moved closer, his expression both fierce and desperate. The others waited behind him. The girl took one slow step forward, then another. The wind whipped between them, carrying the smell of wet earth and gun oil. And then, without a word, she turned her back on them and walked toward the cabin. The man shouted again, furious this time, but she didn't stop. Luke could see the tremor in her hands as she passed him. Fear, maybe, or defiance. The riders watched her disappear into the cabin, then turned their gaze toward Luke. One of them spat in the mud. Another made a gesture that spoke of warning. Then they wheeled their horses and vanished into the rain, leaving only their tracks behind. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low. The girl sat by it again, staring into the flames. Her hands were clenched around something, a small piece of carved wood, shaped like a bird. Luke hadn't seen it before. She held it tightly as though it was all she had left of another life. The storm raged through the night. Luke sat near the window, keeping watch. He knew the men would return. He could feel it in his bones. The question wasn't if, it was when. By dawn, the rain had stopped. The world was still. The girl was asleep at last, her breathing steady. Luke looked out at the clearing sky, the tracks half erased by the rain, and felt the weight of what lay ahead. He didn't know who those men were, or what they wanted. But he knew this much. The girl wasn't just some silent slave. She was part of something larger, something dangerous, and it was coming straight for them. And as the first light of morning touched the valley, Luke understood that whatever path he'd stepped onto the day he raised his hand at that auction, it was far from over. The days after the storm passed in uneasy silence. The sun returned, burning the land dry again. Yet the valley felt different, haunted. The rain had washed away the tracks of the 3 riders, but their presence lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. The girl, still silent, still unreadable, moved with more caution now. She watched the horizon often, as if waiting for those men to reappear. Luke Callahan had lived through gunfights, cattle drives, and nights colder than death itself, but never had he felt a silence so heavy as the one that now filled the cabin. It was not peace, it was the breath before a storm. He knew the men would come back. The question was when and why. He spent his days preparing. He cleaned his old rifle, checked the bullets he had left, and made sure the horse was ready in case they needed to ride hard. But the girl didn't run. She stayed. That, more than anything, puzzled him. She had seen her captors again, and still she chose to remain beside him. There was something binding her here, something deeper than fear. Sometimes, when the night grew long, Luke would wake to find her sitting by the dying embers of the fire, holding that carved wooden bird in her hands. She would stare at it, tracing its shape with her fingers, her face caught between grief and determination. Then, before dawn, she would tuck it away again, as though it were a secret she couldn't afford to share. By the 5th day after the storm, Luke spotted smoke far to the north, thin, rising like a whisper from the hills. He didn't need to guess who it belonged to. The men were camping nearby, watching. He tried not to show his worry, but the girl noticed. She always noticed. That night, she placed something on the table between them before he could speak. It was a strip of deerskin, old and worn, marked with faint symbols burned into the surface. A map, perhaps, or a warning. Luke didn't understand it, but he could tell it meant something. When he looked up, she met his eyes for the first time in days. There was no fear in them, only resolve. The following morning, before the sun had climbed above the ridge, Luke found her outside the cabin. She was kneeling in the dirt, her hands pressed to the earth, whispering something so faint the wind carried it away. When she stood, her face was calm again. Whatever prayer she had spoken was finished. That same morning the riders returned. They came fast from the north, 3 dark figures cutting through the dust. Luke saw them first. Then the girl. She didn't run this time. Instead, she walked to the edge of the porch, her back straight, her hair catching the sunlight like black fire. The riders halted at a distance. Their leader, a tall man with a scar across his jaw, watched in silence. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the dry earth. The others stayed behind, their hands resting on their holsters. The leader stepped closer, and the girl's stillness hardened into steel. She lifted her chin slightly, and though no words passed between them, something old and unfinished flared in the space between their eyes. Luke could see it now. The man was Apache too, older, harder, but of the same blood. The way he looked at her was not as a stranger, but as someone who once belonged to her world. The wind carried the smell of dust and gunpowder. The man raised a hand, signaling his companions to stay back. Then he pointed toward her, his meaning clear. She was his to claim. Luke's heart pounded. He didn't move, not yet. This was not his language, not his war. But when the man took another step forward, the girl moved behind Luke, her hand gripping his sleeve, not in fear but in finality. That single gesture changed everything. The Apache man's expression darkened. In his eyes, betrayal burned like wildfire. He shouted something in his tongue, fierce, bitter, and the other 2 riders spread out, circling. Luke stepped forward, his shadow cutting across the dust. The rifle in his hand was old but steady. The man stopped, his anger colliding with the cold silence of a man ready to die for what he'd chosen. For a long moment, no one breathed. Then the first gun fired. The valley exploded into chaos. The air filled with smoke, dust, and the sharp crack of bullets. Luke dropped to one knee, firing once, twice, hitting one of the riders square in the chest. The man fell, his horse bolting into the distance. The second rider swung wide, circling toward the cabin. The girl ducked low, grabbing a knife from the table inside. Luke's rifle jammed after the third shot, the hammer sticking halfway. He cursed under his breath, switching to the revolver at his belt. The Apache leader charged, drawing his own weapon. They collided in a burst of fury, 2 men bound by opposite worlds, yet caught in the same dust of survival. The girl's cry split the air as Luke fell hard. The gun knocked from his hand. The Apache pressed a blade to his throat, shouting words in a tongue Luke didn't understand. But before the knife could fall, the girl lunged from behind, her small frame moving with the speed of memory. The blade in her hand flashed once in the sunlight, then silence. The Apache froze. His eyes widened as he turned toward her, the knife slipping from his fingers. Blood spilled down his chest, staining the ground. He reached toward her, not in anger, but sorrow. Then he fell. The wind picked up again, scattering dust across the valley. The last rider turned and fled, disappearing over the ridge, his cries fading into the endless desert. When the silence returned, it was heavier than before. The girl stood over the fallen man, the knife still in her hand. She was trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of what she had done. Luke pushed himself up, the pain in his ribs sharp but alive. He watched her kneel beside the dead man, whispering something soft, ancient, a farewell only the wind would carry. As the sun dipped low, Luke helped her back to the cabin. She didn't resist. Her face was pale, her eyes lost somewhere far beyond the horizon. Inside, the fire burned low. Luke sat across from her, watching as she cleaned the blood from her hands in a basin of water. The carved wooden bird lay beside her again, untouched but ever present. She placed it gently near the window, letting the last light of day fall upon it. He realized then that the man who had attacked them wasn't just an enemy, he had been family, brother, perhaps, protector once, hunter now. Whatever he had meant to her, he was gone, and she had chosen a different fate. Outside, the coyotes began to howl, their cries echoing through the canyon. The world felt emptier, yet somehow clearer. Luke looked out at the desert and knew it was far from over. Death had come once, it would come again. But something had changed between them now. They were bound not by debt or pity, but by survival, by blood, by something that had no name. The girl sat quietly, her face turned toward the stars. Her silence was no longer hollow, it was full of meaning, full of the ghosts that followed her. And in that stillness Luke knew, the past was not done with them yet. Beyond the hills, another campfire burned faintly in the dark. Someone else was watching, waiting, and with that faint, distant light, their next storm began to rise. The body of the Apache warrior was buried by sunrise. The girl insisted on it through gesture and solemn presence, guiding Luke to where the earth lay soft beneath a cedar tree just east of the cabin. The burial was quiet, marked only by the wind threading through dry branches and the hush of shifting dust. She placed the carved wooden bird upon the fresh mound, pressing her palm to the soil for several silent moments, as if anchoring the spirit of the fallen to a safe resting place. Whatever connection had bound her to the man, family, tribe, blood, it was sealed there, under the weight of the desert. But death does not end a past, it only forces it to follow more quietly. In the hours after, she drifted like a figure lost between worlds. Luke patched his ribs with cloth and grit, but the wound that troubled him more was the one he could not see, the fear growing like a shadow behind the girl's dark eyes. Her silence seemed heavier now, not because she was alone, but because now someone else would come looking. Luke had questions burning in his chest, but he respected what the girl could not yet speak. He had seen grief before. Grief stripped language from even the strongest. So he worked instead, repaired the gate, strengthened the door, prepared the old rifle for another storm. The sun climbed high before noon when he noticed her watching him, not with fear, not with uncertainty, but with something new, something that felt like trust, or the beginning of it. She joined him outside, helping to gather stones, stacking them to form a low barrier facing the valley. There was intention behind her work. This was not preparation to flee. This was preparation to stay. Then in the distance, a hawk circled. She stopped. Her gaze sharpened, following its arc across the horizon. Luke's chest tightened. The hawk was a signal, a message only she understood. When it dipped low and soared north, her shoulders stiffened. Trouble was close. As dusk approached, a warm wind crept along the valley. Strange heat, unnatural for the cooling hour. The girl stepped out into the open, listening. Her hand touched her heart, fingers resting over a scar hidden beneath cloth. The desert seemed to breathe with her. One long inhale before the break, Luke felt it too. The tension, the changing air. He checked the rifle again. But ammunition was running thin. If war returned to the cabin tonight, they would not survive long behind wood and grit. The girl suddenly moved to the ridge, dragging the map skin she had shown him before. She spread it against the rock and traced symbols into the dust. Luke joined her, silently watching patterns form. Mountains, rivers, trails. A route, a warning, a plan. She pointed west, toward land that stretched wide and empty into territories Luke had rarely crossed. A place where law was distant, and the land belonged to those strong enough to claim it. They could run there, she seemed to say. There was safety in the open, in distance. But to Luke, running tasted too much like surrender. Night fell heavy. A coyote's cry shattered the quiet. Short, frantic, wrong. Luke stepped out onto the porch, gun in hand. The girl stood behind him, her breath thin, her posture rigid. It wasn't the coyote that frightened her. It was what chased it. Then they heard it, not hooves, not voices, drums, faint at first, then building, a pulse against the distant cliffs, echoing through the canyon walls. It was not a ritual of celebration. It was a warning, a verdict. Something ancient and unforgiving had decided their fate. The girl sank to the ground, her hand over her ears, as if the sound struck deeper than Luke could comprehend. The beat wasn't meant for him. It was a call to her blood, a summoning of ghosts she had hoped to outrun. Luke crouched beside her, placing his hand on her shoulder. She didn't pull away. Her eyes glistened, not with tears, but with the pain of recognition. Those drums meant only one thing. More were coming. Not bounty hunters, not slavers, Apache warriors, and they would not care who bought her or why. To them she was a stolen soul. The fire crackled behind them as the drums grew louder, the sound vibrating through bone and dust. Luke moved her inside, shutting the door softly, though he knew it would not stop those who approached. Still, the act meant something, a promise to stand between her and whoever sought to take her. Inside she paced, her silent turmoil shaping the air. Then she did something unexpected. She spoke, not to Luke, not to herself, but to the wooden bird she had carried since the day he found her. She whispered into it, short, broken breaths that were more feeling than language. The flames flickered, drawn to the heat of her emotion. When she finished, she placed the carving into Luke's hand. Her eyes told him what words could not. Protect it. If I fall, this must live on. Luke closed his fist around the bird. In that moment he understood the weight he carried. Her story, her people, the blood spilled on both sides. The drums suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was worse, heavy and expectant, like the sky before lightning strikes. Luke looked out the window. Shadows lined the ridge, figures watching, waiting. The girl stood beside him, her posture straight, as though facing trial. The desert exhaled. War had arrived. Luke reached for the lamp, ready to snuff the flame and cloak them in darkness. But before his fingers touched the glass, a voice cut through the air, strong and commanding, not spoken in English, not spoken to Luke, spoken to her, a command, a summons. Her fate pounding at the door, she froze, caught between the world she was born into and the one she had begun to choose. Luke's heart hammered. Whatever happened next would either break them apart or bind them forever beneath the desert moon. And outside, the ghosts of her past waited for one final choice. The desert night stood silent, holding its breath. The flames inside the cabin flickered against the worn wood, trembling with the same unease that lived in Luke's chest. Beyond the window, the ridge was alive with motion. Shadows of men painted in moonlight, their faces marked by the same crimson bands he had seen on the fallen warrior days before. They had come for her. The girl did not move. She stood rooted near the door, her figure outlined by the trembling glow. Her silence was not fear, it was recognition. The past had finally found her, wearing the faces of her kin, yet bearing the wrath of a tribe betrayed. The night seemed to whisper her name through the canyon, calling her home or to judgment. Perhaps both. Luke's hand gripped the rifle. He had faced death before, but never with the weight of another soul tethered to his. He could have fled. He could have left her to the justice of her people and walked away into the safety of the prairie. But he did not move, because something in him had shifted long ago, perhaps at that auction where she first stood chained and silent. The moment he raised his hand, he had made a choice that no bullet or tribe could now undo. Outside, the drums began again. Low, relentless, the kind that shake the dust loose from old bones and remind every living thing of what it fears most, its end. Luke knew there would be no talking, no peace. The Apache did not come to bargain. They came to reclaim. He stepped forward, pushing open the door slowly, the old hinges crying into the night. The moon spread its light over the land, revealing the ridge now lined with riders, their horses restless beneath them. Torches burned in their hands like scattered stars fallen to the ground. The leader dismounted, a tall man, his body painted with ash and ochre, a mark of death carried across his chest, his eyes burned with purpose. The girl stepped out beside Luke, her head bowed, her bare feet pressed into the cold dust. She did not hide behind him. She faced them, her brothers, her blood. The air between them thickened, alive with 1,000 unspoken words. Her silence spoke of exile, of choices made under chains, of a spirit not broken but reshaped by survival. The warriors did not shout or threaten. They only waited, watching her. Waiting to see if she would return, or if she was lost to them forever. Luke's breath came shallow. He could see how her body trembled, though she stood tall. The firelight caught the edge of her face, soft and fierce all at once, a woman born from two worlds, belonging wholly to neither. Then, slowly, she turned to Luke. No words, only a look, the same kind that had spoken to him that first night, when he untied her hands and offered her water instead of commands. A look that said more than language ever could. She reached into his hand and took the carved wooden bird, the token she had asked him to protect. Her fingers brushed his, and for an instant, time folded inward. The drums fell away. The wind stilled. The world waited. She stepped forward toward the warriors, lifting the carving high into the moonlight. The leader's eyes narrowed. Recognition flickered across his face. The bird was not a trinket. It was a sacred symbol, a piece of their past, perhaps belonging to the chief himself, perhaps marking her as kin to one who had once led them. Whispers rippled through the men. The torches swayed. The leader hesitated. Luke's heart pounded, unsure whether to hope or to fear. The girl dropped to one knee, pressing the bird to her forehead, then lifted it again. The gesture was one of surrender, or plea, or remembrance. Maybe all three. Then something shifted among them. The warriors lowered their weapons. The leader stepped closer. He looked at her, then at Luke. Whatever judgment had brought him here seemed to dissolve into the dust. He reached down, touching the carving gently, then nodded once, a gesture of acceptance. The tribe turned away, their drums falling silent, fading into the endless desert dark. The girl remained kneeling long after the torches vanished into the distance. Luke stood watching her, the rifle hanging useless at his side. The stars brightened above them, cold and clear, as if nothing had ever disturbed their light. When she finally rose, her face was unreadable. Something inside her had changed. The fear that once lived in her eyes was gone, replaced by something quieter, a peace that comes only after one has faced both past and fate. She turned back toward the cabin, walking slowly. Luke followed, every step heavy with disbelief and awe. The night no longer threatened, it only listened. Inside, she placed the wooden bird upon the shelf, its shadow stretching long across the wall. She touched it once, then looked at Luke. There was still silence between them, but it no longer felt empty, it felt whole. Days passed. The desert softened. The wind no longer carried drums or warnings. The girl began to move through the cabin as though it had always been hers, gathering herbs by the creek, mending the worn fabric on the chair, feeding the horse that once feared her presence. She smiled sometimes, faintly, when the sun touched the land just right. Luke watched from a distance, understanding that she was not his to own, nor his to save. She was her own freedom, carved from pain and persistence. Yet, in her quiet companionship, he found a peace he had never known. Weeks later, as summer thinned the grass and heat shimmered across the horizon, he rode into town for supplies. The townsfolk had heard stories, of an Apache spirit seen near his land, of drums and fire in the hills. They asked questions, hungry for tales. He gave them none. Some truths were not meant for their kind of talk. When he returned, he found her outside the cabin, standing by the cedar tree where the warrior was buried. She was placing flowers, wild desert blooms in full color, rare and fleeting. Her hair caught the evening light like the edge of a flame, and for the first time since the auction, she looked at him fully, without fear, without hesitation. Her gaze was steady, knowing. That night, the wind carried the soft song of crickets across the plain. The stars burned brighter, as if watching a story come full circle. The cabin, once silent and haunted, was now filled with life again. Simple, wordless life. She spoke little, but she no longer needed to. The silence between them had become something sacred. Luke often thought back to the auction, the moment the auctioneer's voice had echoed across the crowd. 50% off for the silent Apache slave. He remembered the way no one moved, the way shame had hung in the air thicker than dust, until his own hand rose, without thought, without reason, guided only by a pull he could not explain. Now, standing on that same desert land, he understood what that moment had truly meant. It was not pity, it was not ownership, it was the beginning of freedom, for them both. As the sun sank behind the mountains, the sky painted itself in red and gold, the wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain. The girl, no longer a slave, no longer silent, closed her eyes and lifted her face toward the horizon, and Luke, watching her, knew that some stories don't end in thunder or blood, some end quietly, with a choice made in compassion, and a hand raised not in power, but in grace.